Welcome to the Screen the Screener College Basketball Podcast with your hosts, Mike Randall and Gus Kearns.
Welcome in, listeners, to the Screen the Screener College Basketball Podcast, where we're always talking everything college hoops. You could have been anywhere else on the dial, but you chose to be here with us, Mike and Gus. And luckily, today, we're not by ourselves. We have Austin Veazey. Austin is going to talk to us about Florida State. You can give him a follow at Noles, Vikes, V's. That's capital N, capital V, capital V. And of course, please give him a follow over at the Nole Game Day on Twitter. Austin, thank you so much for giving us a couple minutes. How's everything going on your end?
Great, man. Appreciate you having me.
Of course. Thank you for giving the time to the podcast and to the listeners. I think we can just jump right in. Let's talk about last year. Florida State has taken that next step as a hoops program over the past 5+ years. Constant contender inside the conference. NBA lottery picks galore. They've created a definite culture of team first over individual stats and box scores. Last season included Sweet 16, second in the ACC, 14th in that in the final rankings. Austin, can you just outline a few highlights from the season for the listeners of the Seminoles?
It was always going to be tough for them to follow up the 2019-20 team. It's just the success they had with Trent Forrest, Devin Vassell, Patrick Williams. Just the success those guys had that should have been a Final Four team had COVID not canceled the NCAA tournament.
Right.
So to follow that up, you lose one of the best players in program history in Forrest, and you bring in a guy like Scotty Barnes, who's never played point guard before. They transitioned him from a small forward, power forward hybrid to full-time point guard in the ACC, and that's tough. There were some highs. There's a lot of highs. You talk about his game winner in overtime against Indiana.
Right.
You go, you beat Florida for a 7th straight time, beating Louisville on the road. There's always going to be highs, especially in the Sweet 16 season. That game against Colorado in the tournament especially stands out. Just a dominating performance. They really put McKinley Wright up against the ropes, and Wright didn't have any answers. And the last one that really stands out was the game at home against Virginia on Big Monday, obviously primetime game. And that was their best offensive performance against Virginia in almost 20 years. And to see Virginia get blown out like that, you just don't see it because they're so good about keeping it in tight, keeping games close. And to see Florida State score 80 points, win by 20, that just doesn't happen against Virginia kind of teams.
I agree. That's a little bit of an anomaly. And you mentioned the last second shot for Barnes against Indiana and the domination that you've had over the Gators of recent history. And then I think any time that you can, put up 80 on a Coach Bennett team, super impressive. And you mentioned that all the talent was there. You mentioned some of the returns. We'll get to those guys a little bit later. The next question has to be about COVID. Last season was difficult, arduous for every program in the country. What specific things did Florida State have to jump over hurdle-wise in the ACC map and maybe make sure that they could still achieve that level that they've been living at for the past couple of seasons? What were some of the unique challenges?
Yeah, I kind of already talked about it with trying to transition Scotty Barnes into a full-time point guard role. And with no off-season, or very limited off-season, I should say, basically all their time was spent practicing offense, and they said, well, we'll just stick with what we did on defense from the year before, even if it's probably not what we think is the best, but we got to get this offense up to speed if we think we have a chance. And the offense went through its lumps. There was times where Barnes was too passive, especially in ball screens. There are times he should have just gotten downhill, put his head down, try and draw some contact. But at times he wanted to get others involved too much instead of just letting the game flow from him. And that was the biggest drop-off from losing a guy like Trent Forrest. So as talented as Barnes is, he still had to learn the nuances of the point guard position. And then obviously here and there, like every team deals with COVID issues. Florida State had 2 COVID pauses throughout the season. Mm-hmm. And it turned out, I found out after both were due to false positives. So it wasn't like there was anything they could have done about it. I wish there was a way that you could have retested and play that game in Boston College or play that game home against Duke. But it just didn't happen.
Right.
The first COVID pause really helped them. They got 2 weeks to practice, learn the offense a little bit better. And they came out and had their best offensive performance of the season against NC State, scoring like 104 points, I think it was. It just
I remember that
dominated
game.
them.
Yeah.
Just absolutely dominated.
And you mentioned the lack of prep time, practice time in the preseason. And, through this team preview series that we've been doing here on the podcast, that's one of the common factors. Like they just didn't have the court time, the teaching time, the coaching time with those student athletes. And for whatever reason, some teams thrived and some teams really struggled with it. And you mentioned and highlighted what Florida State was dealing with, of course. And I think highlighting like trying to implement and incorporate Scotty Barnes at the point guard position, I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And I think, your team, your squad obviously ended up doing okay and figured a couple things out. All right, Austin, one of the things that is so hard to keep track of is this transfer portal, the roller coaster that it is. It has so many passengers. Florida State dipped in this season. Can you please catch the listeners up on some of the new faces on the roster for the Seminoles, whether it be through the transfer portal or maybe an incoming freshman that we might need to pay attention to?
Yeah, the transfer portal giveth and it taketh. So you lose guys like Cedar Calhoun, who was a dynamic shooter and a dynamic athlete. You also lose Nate Jack to Cleveland State, who's a great shooter but didn't really contribute a ton. But you replace that with Caleb Mills from Houston, who was freshman of the year in the American Conference, was preseason player of the year before dealing with ankle injuries. Only played 4 games at Houston before deciding to transfer and come to Florida State. He's arguably the best scorer Florida State's had since Dwayne Bacon. Okay. That guy can just get buckets. And Florida State desperately needs that for this year's team. And he can handle the ball a little bit too. I know he's probably going to start at the 2, but if you need him to play in a pinch, he can play at the 1. And I absolutely think he can. And you also bring in a guy, Cameron Fletcher from Kentucky, the perfect low-risk, high-reward addition, because things were strange. I've never seen a coach call out a player on Twitter saying, hey, we're sending him home for a few weeks, like Coach Cal did with Cameron Fletcher. But by the end of the season, Coach Cal was super complimentary of the growth Fletcher had and was super comfortable bringing him back to the team. He said it was a great positive energy. If the staff's comfortable with him, so am I, because all he wants to do is play defense and win. And if that's not Leonard Hamilton, I don't know what is.
Right. That totally fits into your culture, no doubt. And I think if you're going to bring in 2 high-level transfers like you're talking about with Caleb Mills and Cameron Fletcher, then I think something's going right for Coach Hamilton and the staff over there. All right, let's talk about those returners, Austin. The Coach Hamilton always seems to have those trusted veterans. Who are some of the returners that Coach is going to trust in those crucial moments with important minutes?
Anthony Platt's obviously the first name that comes to mind. He was phenomenal last season. And through his first couple of seasons, a lot of fans are like, I don't really know what Polite is at this point.
Right.
He was awesome. Fantastic defender, fantastic three-point shooter, improved as a ball handler, improved as a finisher, doubled his points, doubled his minutes. It's exactly what you want from a developing player. And now he's your most trusted guy. He's probably going to be a captain. He was with the Trent Force. He was all the way back on that Elite 8 team as a redshirt. So He's seen the success. Then you have a guy like Malik Osborne, transferred in from Rice a few years ago. He was great at the 5 in the 1920 season, then fully transitioned to the perimeter last season as a 4, and his stats were nearly identical. I posted it on Twitter a few weeks ago that his second most statistical comparison ever was the year before of himself. And that's just rare for someone that plays 2 separate positions to have that similar production of a season. And you have Wyatt Wilkes off the bench who can shoot. Raekwon Evans, who struggled a little bit last year. He had his flashes, but it's still a solid point guard that you can use to bring a very talented freshman point guard like Jalen Worley along.
Right.
I think that's what you need. And then you have Tenor Ngom, who they brought as a grad transfer last year, but he got the super senior. He's talented, but he's super raw. I think this is only his 4th or 5th year ever playing organized basketball. So he's got the talent. He's just got to find a way to rein it in a little bit.
It seems like he's exactly one of those players that thrives in the Florida State culture where they anchor the defense on the interior and then, can get some putback baskets and stuff like that. So that seems like that is a perfect scenario for him, especially developing as an athlete and as a student athlete. All right, Austin, let's look inside the ACC. It's always a grind. Florida State is always near the top. Virginia, UNC, Duke, all of these familiar names. Which rivalry in the conference is going to help define this particular season for the Seminoles? And what game do you think might be a bellwether for how the things are going to go long term, maybe into March?
So these are the teams that FSU plays twice: Clemson, Duke, Miami, NC State, Syracuse, Wake Forest. Obviously, the one that jumps off the page is Duke. Yep. Duke's reloaded with talent, with Banchero. It's Coach K's last season. They want to be right back where they expect to be. That's obviously going to be the benchmark. If you can beat Coach K one of these two games, you belong in the top four, like Florida State does belong. There's a couple other games you look at, like I think Syracuse is going to be really interesting this year because it's a different Syracuse team where it's more offensively talented than defensively talented. They don't have the length on the wings that you're normally used to. But the game I always look at, for some reason, Florida State and Louisville just do not like each other. And it goes back to Chris Mack just absolutely killing us in the round of 32 at Xavier in 2016?
Good point.
Or 2017.
Yeah.
It goes back to that, and that team just has not forgotten it. Ever since then, they've made it a point to go really hand it to Chris Mack. So in early January, Louisville comes to the Tucker Center for a game that Florida State's if everything lines up, Florida State opens their home schedule with Syracuse in the conference. That will be to tie the ACC record for most consecutive home conference wins. Then the next game is Louisville to break the record in early January. So that place is going to be electric. There's already some bad blood there. I'm getting goosebumps thinking about the last time Louisville came to the Tucker Center and Trent Forrest dropped one on Jordan Nora.
I kind of remember that as well. Oh, man. Trent Forrest did that to a couple people, not just Nora. I'm with you on that. I think that outline and spelling out for the listeners exactly what's at stake and maybe something that people aren't paying attention to, like that is a real thing that Florida State is going to hold in precious hands. So I'm totally intrigued by that as well. And I think they almost can't wait for that grind to happen inside the ACC. All right.
They always look forward to it. Like in the locker room, there's a board that they always have the ACC standings, and they change it every single day. They really care about how well they're doing in the ACC.
You know what? That just speaks to some of the things that we've talked about on the podcast in the past, where college basketball is one of the most unique sports that anybody can follow because it gives those four distinct opportunities for every team in the nation, all 350 plus, right? Where you can, make some noise in the non-conference and get that like signature win. Then you can just jump into the conference schedule. And then maybe somebody on your schedule in the conference schedule is going to give you that signature win, or you can just reset your season. Then, of course, the conference tournament, and that gives everybody new life. And then, of course, March Madness. So I think that Florida State pays attention to, phase two of that, season outline. That really speaks to how much they value playing against these teams, these legendary teams, these blue blood teams, and saying like, yeah, we belong.
Absolutely. They have a claim to be called new bloods for a reason. You don't be in the top four of the ACC by just, winning a game here and there. You go out there and by beating these blue bloods, They should have won at Carolina last year, but let it slip out of their hands. They got them back in the conference tournament and won at home. I think they would have handled Duke pretty well last season had they gotten to play. And then you go back to season before. The last time FSU lost in the Tucker Center to a conference team was the Cam Reddish buzzer beater in early January of 2019. And that game was back and forth. Zion leaves at halftime. RJ Barrett and Cam Reddish just stepped up. And it was such a back and forth, such a great game that, a lot of the nation was like, this Florida State team can do something.
Yeah, and I think that was like Cam Reddish's like defining moment as a college student athlete. I'm sorry that you guys fell prey to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I was sitting under that basket because I was still a manager for the team then. I'm sitting under that basket. I see the play happening and literally in slow motion before my eyes. And he comes over and I'm like, oh, how? What happened?
Well, all right, listeners, we're talking to Austin Veazey. He does great work. He brings you the best FSU hoop content over at the Nole Game Day. please don't forget to give a follow on the internet, NoleGameDay.com. And if you're really looking for anything that is associated with Florida State, si.com/college/FSU. Austin, let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at that non-conference schedule. The non-conference schedule is always loaded. Provide a game or two that exists that they're going to circle with Sharpie on the non-con that listeners should really tune into, hopefully next month.
It's not as strong as we're used to. Obviously, you have the game against Florida. That's always one I circle, being a Florida native and growing up an hour from Gainesville. That's always one I have circled. You get your revenge game against UCF, neutral site against South Carolina, but it's all meh. But that ACC Big Tournament or ACC Big Ten Challenge game at Purdue in Mackey Arena. It's the third time in 4 years Florida State's playing Purdue. And it's just this clash of styles that I think is so interesting, because you have Florida State that wants to get out in transition, wants to swarm you on defense with their length. And you have Purdue wants to slow it down, run the offense through Trevion Williams, play big bully ball. It's just this clash of styles that you love to see in college basketball. And I wish we got to play a team outside of Indiana, but Purdue's going to be really good. They're going to be a top 10 team, no doubt. I wish we could have gotten a chance at Michigan again, or maybe in Ohio State, but it's hard to complain with a team like Purdue that's honestly pretty similar to Florida State, that they've had a lot of success the last few years that just hasn't gone as noticed.
Correct. Maybe especially last season with Purdue bowing out to North Texas in that first round. So maybe they're flying a little bit under the radar, or whatever term you want to use there. But I don't know. I think it's logical that you can make an argument for Purdue as a Final Four team. So if you're going to have that on your non-conference schedule, I mean, that's a huge opportunity for Florida State right there. All right.
I agree. Purdue was super young, and they bring back almost everybody. We already talked about Trevion Williams, but they bring back Zach Edey, Jaden Ivey, Eric Hunter. They bring back almost everybody from a team that was super talented.
And those pieces kind of fit together. You mentioned Edey can do stuff inside. You mentioned Ivey. He's a terror on the perimeter on both sides of the ball, and might be one of those players that explodes this season. And we all know what Trevion Williams does. I mean, he can batter people on the inside and is a completely underrated ball mover and passer in the post. Yeah, he's totally fantastic. So all those pieces actually fit together for Purdue. I'm with you on that. All right, let's get you out of here on this one, Austin. If you're going to look into your crystal ball for the Seminoles, what do you think might happen? What do you think might exist in this particular season for this particular edition of Florida State hoops?
It's tough. They lost a lot from last year's team. You lose Raekwon Gray and Balsha Kuprovic a year early. If you get one of those guys back, you're talking a Final Four team, because they just have that talent. Yeah. They don't really have that big man this year, which you're not used to seeing from Florida State. But the way college basketball is going, just being completely revolved around guard play, I think Florida State fits right in seamlessly between – we already talked about Raekwon Evans. I mentioned Jalen Worley, but he's a super talented player for a freshman that's going to play the game at his own pace. You have Caleb Mills, who we talked about his scoring ability, Anthony Polite and his steadiness. You could bring in another 5-star freshman in Matthew Cleveland, who can really score the basketball. You got a lot of guys on the perimeter that can do some damage. We'll see how that works out. I think they're a little bit too inexperienced to make it like a super deep run to that Final Four or maybe an Elite Eight. I still think Sweet 16's about where they'll finish this year. Top 4 ACC, no doubt in my mind. Just because ACC is tough, but I still think Florida State's got the talent, got the experience, and definitely has the coaching to get ahead of some of the others. So Sweet 16, top 2 or 3 ACC seed, I think that's fair.
I think that's very fair. I think that's unbelievably optimistic for all the Seminole fans out there. Austin, so thankful. Please follow, spread some kindness, support, and interest towards Austin and his fine work over at the Nole Game Day. And please give him a follow on Twitter at Noles Vikes V's this season. That would be amazing. Austin, please enjoy the start of the season. Hope to catch up later on during the season. And thanks for catching up the listeners with what needs to happen for Florida State to reach those high goals that you laid out so astutely.
Absolutely. I appreciate you having me on. And Honestly, welcome to come back anytime.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Austin. Cheers, cilantro, gratulazia, everybody.